So let's begin with this background on the New Testament. First thing to note is the question, is the New Testament mystical? Or do mystics interpret the New Testament mystically? By which we mean is, can you find anything in the New Testament that parallels, say, Meister Eckhart or Bernard of Clairvaux? Well, you can find some things, but there's clearly development, historical development change through time. And what they're often doing is retrojecting or reading back their ideas into a text. Now, this is important to note the distinction between the way modern people read the scriptures and the way medieval people read the scriptures. Modern people read the scriptures often in a historical critical way, which is to try to find out what the text meant in its original setting, or they read it in a moralizing way. That is, they look at the text for moral advice, or they read it theologically just to get a sense of the nature of God and so forth. So if you look at, for example, a conference the last couple of weeks ago, nobody gave a mystical reading of a text at any point in conference, as far as I could tell. I mean, I was asleep during part of it. But at any rate, what they're talking about is generally doctrine, that is some theological issue, or they're talking about a daily application, that is how this passage instructs us for moral excellence or something like that. Now, the medieval guys did those things too. Okay, and in fact, so did New Testament guys. The mystical reading is a different way of approaching the text, and it is not uniquely medieval, but it is certainly an integral part of the way medieval people approach these texts. Okay, now when I ask about mystical elements in the New Testament, what I'm talking about here are things that you find in the New Testament that are viewed as foundational for medieval mystics. Whether or not these guys, whether that's what it really meant or something like that in a historical critical sense is a different question. But these are the things that they looked at and said, aha, here's a model for the mystical life. Notice there is what you would call extrasensory things going on. That is, things that you don't see with your eyes and touch with your hands. These would be dreams, prophecies, visions, Book of Revelation, stuff like that. All right? The medieval mystics tried to emulate the New Testament figures by having these experiences too, which they interpreted as the mystical experience. Okay? So that's foundational, what they do. Now, miracles is another thing. McGinn might not discuss this in detail. I can't remember, but the mystics are associated with saints. Not all mystics are not all saints are mystics, and not all mystics are saints. But there's quite a bit of overlap, and saints are generally associated with miracles in one way or another. Now, in Greek, it's called thaumaturgy. Thaumatos means a wonder, something that's amazing. And urgos means to work or do or make. So thaumaturgy is making a wonder working. And a lot of mystics are associated with miraculous things happening to them or miraculous things they're able to do. For example, St. Francis has the stigmata. We'll talk about him later in his hands and feet. And so that would be a thaumaturgical thing. So that's a close association with that, which may not be so prevalent in modern forms of mysticism. Okay? Another one is exorcism of demons. The medieval people believed in demons as real entities, and following New Testament patterns, they believe that these demons afflict you, and they afflict you with sickness, with madness, and with temptation. Now, we kind of have reduced this to demons afflict you with temptation, right? I mean, in terms of modern Christian concepts. But back then, madness and false visions, false dreams, all sorts of things like that could accompany demons. So part of what the mystic needs to do is get rid of the demons from himself, and then he can exorcise them from others. And you'll see lots of exorcism stories of, these are called hagiographies. What's a hagiography?
Story of a saint.
Right. So hagios means holy or saint, and it comes out as, it's sanctus in Latin, from which comes our word saint. It just means a holy one. So hagiography means writing about the Holy One. That is, writing about a saint's life. And in these hagiographies, you'll see demonic exorcism and miracle working. Very important. Now, exorcism is in fact a form of thaumaturgy, right? I mean, it is a form of miracle working. So when you see the New Testament having these things in it, the mystics interpret them and emulate them. They want to do the things that are described there and interpret them then in this mystical sense. Yeah.
So, Protestants rejected the saints completely as well, even though they had,
yes.
What was their impetus for doing so? Because now it's only Catholics that really carried it.
Right. Well, a saint means a holy one, and from the Protestant perspective, that just means a really good person, a really just person, or one that has received Jesus and has been sanctified through the atonement or something like that. What the Catholics say is a saint is a person who has died and has ascended into heaven and is received into the presence of God on a permanent basis. So they already have their exaltation or whatever, and in that form can intervene with God on behalf of a person. So you put up a petition or a prayer to a saint, and the saint will intervene with God. Now, you're too low and sinful to or maybe obscure for God to care about you, but the saint cares about you because they're the patron saint of your town or whatever.
Right.
And so it is the idea that saints are holy people who can intervene, work miracles after death. Their relics work miracles. That's what the Protestants rejected.
Okay.
So it's not that they're holy people, but that the holy people can have these special powers of, divine, basically intervening on behalf of the ordinary people with God. Okay. Now, ecstasy is kind of standing outside yourself, where we've talked about that before, right? Celestial ascent, that is going up to heaven, having a vision of heaven. Dante's Divine Comedy. Book 3, Paradiso, is an example of that in a literary form, but Dante's a very mystical person. There's all sorts of mysticism behind Dante's thing, and you can't understand him unless you understand medieval mysticism. And he was, in fact, a literary disciple of Bernard of Clairvaux, even though he did never meet him. He lived 150 years or so after. Bernard of Clairvaux is his intermediary for the final phase of the Divine Comedy. That's this guy in the book here. Okay, so he meets Beatrice, and then Bernard of Clairvaux, and then Mary, and then the Trinity. So, and Bernard is his teacher in that regard. Then you've got temple-related things. Now, the temple fades away as an institution and as a structure, but remains as an allegory, very important. And when you read Bernard's three rooms or three places, the garden, the storerooms, and the bedroom, this is the courtyard, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies of the temple. I mean, he's taking these... he's taking the temple as a physical structure and as an institution and as a set of rituals and turning it into an allegory. Now notice, there are some mystical writings in which it's just complete temple allegory, like the Bede of England in the 8th century wrote a book on the temple and a book on the tabernacle. These are big, long allegorical interpretations of all of this. So some places it's explicit, some places it's implicit. Now, asceticism is something that pops up within the mystics throughout the medieval period, and we have a good ascetic description on page 37. This is from Eckhart, that all of those who are bound with attachment to prayer, fasting, vigils, and all kinds of outward discipline and mortification, that's asceticism. So prayer is, of course, obvious in the New Testament. Fasting is obvious in the New Testament. What's a vigil?
Staying up all night.
Yeah, it means keeping watch. And its prototype is when the apostles were commanded to keep watch with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And they failed because the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak, remember? And if they had stayed in the vigil, what would have happened? They would have seen the angel come to Christ, right? I mean, but they fell asleep, so they missed it. So the idea of vigil then is basically sleep deprivation, staying up all night, praying and fasting and so forth. So there's different types of asceticism that you see in the New Testament that is picked up by the mystics, and they become a very ascetic group. That includes sexual asceticism, that is, avoiding sexual activity, marriage, and anything else. Now, there's also a wilderness aspect to this asceticism in its earliest forms. That is, you go out in the wilderness imitating Jesus and Elijah and John the Baptist, who were all wilderness prophets, went out in the wilderness, lived there, that type of thing. Facing and overcoming temptation, defeating Satan, that's exorcism here. Angelic intervention, having a vision of an angel or something. All of this is based on Jesus' 40-day ministry, right? 40 days in the wilderness. Right? He goes in the wilderness, he fasts for 40 days, he's tempted by the devil, he overcomes and casts out Satan, and he receives angelic intervention, as well as being taught. It says he was taught things as well. So this Jesus 40 days in the wilderness is a key incident in the Bible that the mystics try to emulate. They're trying to emulate all these things, have them in their own lives, experience them themselves. Revelation of divine mysteries, everything's an allegory, okay? So medieval Christian mysticism is one giant extended 1,500-year allegory, all right? And this is based in part on New Testament things, but largely based on allegorical mystical parables of Jesus. Some are explicitly said to be mysteries, which they took as something mystical, right? When Jesus talks to the apostles, he says, "To you it is given to know the mysteries of God, but to them it is not given." They ask him, "Why do you teach in parables?" That's what he says. So they interpret it that way, and then also the way the New Testament interprets the Old Testament is allegorical in some ways, and so they use that as a model, okay? Like, mainly they're interpreting the Old Testament esoterically. Then there's lots of messianic interpretations that are going on here, which indicate to the mystics that there is some hidden meaning in the Bible. Okay, when you read the New Testament, you'll see them quoting Old Testament prophecies, and they're frequently Rachel weeping for her children. That there's nothing explicit about Jesus or the Messiah in that, but it is interpreted messianically. Do you see what I mean? So that would be used as an exemplar of how you should really read the Bible for its hidden meaning. And of course, prayer is probably the major mystical thing that mystics like to do. Now, there's also a lot of key terms about mysticism that are in the New Testament that get mystical interpretations. For example, ascent into heaven, is it in the spirit or in the body? You read 2 Corinthians 12, Paul says, "I knew a man who went into the third heaven, whether in the body or out, I know not." So this becomes a big issue. And for the mystics, it's generally out of body. Ascending into heaven, seeing a vision of God, being out of body when you do that. So it becomes a purely a spiritual or a mental thing. Remember, this is the old Neoplatonism, when we'll explain how Neoplatonism interjects itself into Christian mysticism, especially through Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagite, but we'll come to that later. There's also henosis language in John 17 and theopoiesis language, becoming like God in John 17. So this is a really big thing, becoming one and becoming God, which we'll see the mystics talk about all the time. Then there's just the plain mystery language. Mysterion is translated as mystery in King James, and that means a divine secret, and here's places where it occurs. And so you look at the letters of Paul, and he says, "I'm going to reveal to you a mystery." That is, the mystics say, aha, that's mystery. This is mysticism, right? And then there's ecstasis, which means standing outside of the body. And it refers to some visions that Paul had are called ecstasis. And so this is becomes mystical ecstasy. Okay? Now, we need to talk about the issue of Bible translation and how it applies to both. Mainly, we're talking about medieval mysticism here, but it also was important for Jewish mysticism as well. Okay, number one. For the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible was Scripture. Whenever it says Scripture in the New Testament, it's talking about the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible. There was no New Testament during the lifetime of Jesus or the apostles, right? It comes after. So that's the first thing we should note, is the significance of the Old Testament for medieval people is far, far greater than it is for modern Christians, most of whom never read the Old Testament. If they read it, they don't understand it, and if they understand it a little bit, they don't like it. I mean, it's just not a book that makes sense to modern Christians. But for medieval guys, it was a crucial book. Okay, just as important as the New Testament. Now, when in the 2nd century and 1st centuries BC, when the Jews were conquered by the Greeks, first by the Babylonians, then by the Greeks, then by the Romans, the Jews in diaspora and in Israel ceased to speak Hebrew as their daily language and came to speak either Aramaic, which was the main language of Middle Eastern peoples, or Greek, which was the language of the upper class, the aristocrats, after the Greek conquest. Now, because of that, the Old Testament was translated into Aramaic and Greek because they were the two languages that most people spoke. The Aramaic, and these were translated by the Jews themselves for people who didn't know Hebrew to be able to hear the scriptures read and so forth and understand them. So for the Jews, there's the Aramaic translation, which is called the Targum, and the Greek translation, which is called the Septuagint, or sometimes LXX, which is the symbol for 70. This means the book of the 70 translators. Okay? Now, eventually, these books fall away from Hebrew use by Jews, largely because, number one, the Christians use them, and so they don't like that. And number two, Hebrew becomes a more sacred language, and so they want to use that, and they won't have a standard translation. They'll just translate Hebrew into the local tongue. When Aramaic ceased to be the main language of Jews, that you can change things around like that. Anyway, both of those die out among the Jews, but among the Christians, the Syriac Aramaic-speaking Christians had their own version of the Aramaic Bible called the Peshitta, and it's not really based on this, but it's related to this in some way. Then the Septuagint becomes the Bible of the Greek Orthodox Christians. Now notice, the Septuagint is a Jewish translation of the Old Testament, but it included the apocryphal books that are rejected by the Jews. So number one thing to note is medieval Christians had the apocryphal texts that are not in Protestant Bibles. And those texts were important in their mystical interpretations. Okay? But the Greeks used a Jewish translation of the Old Testament and the New Testament in its original language. In the West, the Latin-speaking peoples couldn't use either one of those, right? Because they, some of the really educated guys knew Greek, but none of the ordinary people did. It didn't do any good to use a translation that nobody knew. They spoke Latin out there. So what they do is create their own Latin translation. Now, there was a Jewish Latin translation, in fact, but that has survived only in fragments. And in the around 400 A.D., a guy named Jerome, who was a mystical monk, he has some very interesting mystical vision of God whipping him for his sins, for reading Cicero. That's kind of a cool vision. Anyway, he translates the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible combined together into Latin. And that is a translation by a Christian using both the Hebrew and Greek sources and including the apocryphal and deuterocanonical books. This is the apocryphal books. We explain what those are, right? Everybody knows that? And so what you end up with is two different, I mean, excluding the Syriac and the Coptic Bibles, which are another story, and we're not going to really talk about them. Within Western medieval Christianity, you have the Greek tradition and the Latin tradition. And they have different Bibles, and one was translated by Jews, and one was translated by a Christian, and one has the original New Testament, and one has a Latin translation of the New Testament. And so there's lots of differences between these translations, and a lot of differences between the nuance of the language. For example, in the Eckhart version, we have the term citadel. Okay? In the Greek, it's village. But in medieval Latin, cittadella means little city. That is a village, right? But it also came to mean the citadel being a castle within the town, the little town. That is, you have a city, and then you have a citadel, which is a castle built into the city walls. So the citadel becomes the little town. That is the small part of the big town, the big city. And therefore came to mean a citadel as a fortress. Now, in the original Vulgate, it just meant small town, which is a perfectly good translation. But in medieval Latin, it becomes a citadel, a military fortress. You see what I'm saying? And then he translates it into German in a different way. So all of these terms become amorphous and misunderstood or reinterpreted in all sorts of different ways. So you really do have a Greek tradition and a Latin tradition of mysticism that are not necessarily interconnected. The second phase of that is that the Latin and Greek churches drift apart and then eventually split, and you have a whole set of Greek theologians that are speaking to the Greek church and a different set of Latin theologians speaking to the Latin church. And they don't read each other's theologians, and they go in different directions. For example, and this is one problem with this book, is that he doesn't divide Greek and Latin traditions from each other. He's basically looking at the Latin tradition, but he'll cite here Bernard of Clairvaux. No, I mean Eckhart. No, it's not the one. Gregory of Nyssa. He cites him as it's a good example of a mystical interpretation, but that was in Greek. It was read by the Greeks. It was not read by the Westerners, so it would have no direct influence on them. Likewise, Augustine here is cited, and this is another good exemplar of a mystical interpretation of Psalms. But he was in Latin, and he was only read in the West. Nobody in the East cared about. They'd never heard of him. Okay, so not only do we have two foundational biblical texts, which may or may not relate to the Hebrew Bible in a coherent way, it has additional apocryphal texts, and then is interpreted in different ways as time progresses, along with different theological traditions of mysticism. Does that make sense to everyone? So as we go along here in the course, I will kind of trace the different movements within all of these. Also note, as Madeline mentioned, there's a number of important mystical books of the Bible that are interpreted mystically by the Christians. And notice, Jewish mysticism has exactly the same characteristic of intensely allegorical and mystical interpretations of the Bible. But there's two big differences. Well, three. Number one is they're interpreting the Hebrew Bible, not a Greek or Latin Bible. Number two is they do not have the New Testament. So their interpretations are quite radically different. Notably, lack of any Christology in the Old Testament. And number three is that, they have a whole rabbinic tradition governing their interpretations, whereas the Greeks and Latins have a whole set of Christian theologians which cover there. So they really diverge quite extraordinarily. Although their roots are the same, what they end up with is quite distinct in terms of the details. Does that make sense to everyone, what I'm talking about there? The last thing I want to note is some of the mystical genres. That is to say, literary forms in which mystical texts get down to us. Now notice, when we use mysticism in a modern sense, we tend to talk about mystical experiences. That's not what the medieval guys meant. Now that they included mystical experiences like a vision or a dream or something, that would be part of mysticism. But mystery meant secrets, the inner esoteric secret interpretation of things, or life, or spiritual experiences, or whatever. Okay? So there's a much broader range of mystical things going on, like a mystical interpretation of the liturgy. Has nothing to do with a mystical experience per se, that is a vision of God or something. But it's an integral part of medieval mysticism. Okay, so there's commentaries, which we have examples of here, and sermons. Now, these are the most common literary forms that survive at all. Notice there's probably lots of mystical stuff going on that either A, never gets written down, or B, is not preserved. So just bear that in mind. Just what we have is what survives in a written form, not necessarily everything that was important back then or what was really going on. And we know from different accounts that in a lot of these monasteries, there was a lot of oral mysticism going on. The monks were talking about each other's dreams and visions and so forth, and teaching each of the old monks would teach the new monks, and they wouldn't tell other people about it, and they wouldn't sermonize about it when they gave a sermon. But this was going on. I mean, we have narratives discussing that it was going on, but not necessarily what was going on. Do you see what I mean? We know something's going on. Okay, letters are sometimes public. This would be more like an essay, but sometimes also private. So Bernard, for example, has tons of letters. He was writing letters to lots of correspondents. Some of them are about how to run a monastery, and some of them are about mystical stuff. And again, some of these are private, and some of these are public. Lots of poetry comes on the scene. Now, this comes a little bit later, but mystics tended to write poetry and psalm-like things, like Dante's Divine Comedy is all poetry, right? Bernard of Clairvaux, we have actually two mystics we're going to talk about in this class whose poetry we find in our modern LDS hymn book. Who are they? Okay, all creatures of our God and King, St. Francis of Assisi. St. Bernard, Jesus the very thought of thee. Okay, those are two medieval mystics who wrote poetry, and their poetry has been transformed into hymns, and then the hymns into English translation and so forth. Notice what Bernard is saying. Jesus the very thought of thee with sweetness fills my breast. But greater far thy face to see in the mystical vision, and in thy presence rest, as he talks about in here, right? You entering into the rest is the supreme goal of the mystic, that is the rest of God. So his poetry, if read in its original context, is all about his mystical experiences that he wrote in poetic form, which gets translated in English and then passed on down. And most Latter-day Saints who sing it have no idea what he's really talking about, right? I mean, it's more kind of like a general emotional thing, okay? Now, hagiography we've talked about. These are saints' lives. Apothegm is a strange word for just sayings, but this is kind of the technical term. And it means the oral teachings of monks that are, and not necessarily monks, mostly monks, but other saints, just holy men and women, who taught orally, and then their disciples wrote them down.
Is this like hadith?
It's somewhat like hadith, except they don't tend not to have any isnad, but yeah, I mean, they're similar to hadith.
Okay.
Now, in fact, much of the New Testament are described by these guys as the apothegm of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, right? It's just, Jesus was walking along and something happened and he said something and they wrote it down. I mean, there is a narrative context to the New Testament, a narrative flow, but a lot of it is just completely disconnected sayings of Jesus that, have no the setting has no significance. Does that make sense? And so monks and saints, their disciples, thought these guys were holy people and thought their sayings were very important, and so they remembered them. They told their friends. They told, when he's an old man and there's young monks and said, wow, you knew St. Anthony. What did he have to say? What was he like? And so they tell stories about him. And some of them get written into saints' lives, which are narrative stories of the saints, focusing on their miracles and wonder working and stuff. But within the saints' lives, there's always sayings of the saints. And then sometimes we only have just collections of sayings, the teachings of so-and-so, especially with the desert monks. Okay, last thing we need to note. Oh, good grief, we only have 8 minutes. Is the monastic characteristic of medieval mysticism. That is to say, most of these guys, nearly all of them, are monks or nuns. The women are nuns, the men are monks, right? Everybody understands that about monasticism, the difference between the two. I mean, it's essentially the same thing, except because monks take a vow of chastity, they have gender separation within monastic movements. And usually they'll have a male monastic order and a female monastic order. Sometimes they have the same name. Some orders are only male or female, and some are both. And so, for example, the Franciscans have a female movement that's part of the Franciscan movement, but they're called the Clares, Clare being Francis's most important female disciple. Okay? So, and then there's the Carmelite nuns are only nuns. And I think the Jesuits are only men. I don't think there's any female Jesuits. You see what I mean? So it just depends on the order and the circumstances. But women could be monastic as nuns, and men were monastic as monks. So monasticism then is fundamental to medieval mysticism in both the Greek Orthodox and the Catholic worlds.
But the Greek Orthodox aren't necessarily, like, the priests can marry.
Yes, it depends on the circumstances and the situation, but monks are not necessarily priests. Monks are, now you can have been married, your wife dies, and then you can enter a monastery, but as a general rule, monastic orders are more strict than priestly orders. And you can be a monk without being a priest. You can be a priest without being a monk. So there are separate institutions within medieval Catholicism. We'll talk about monasticism more later when we, maybe like 2 times from now, when we talk about the rise of desert monasticism and its impact on mysticism. But for right now, we just have to recognize that monastic nature of medieval mysticism. That only changes maybe in the 14th and 15th centuries AD. So for the first 1,000 years of Christian mysticism, almost all these guys are monks. Okay? Any questions on that stuff? Well, we only have a few minutes left, but there are a couple of other things we need to look at about them again. We've already explained the division between Greek and Latin mysticism, right? So just bear that in mind, and we will pursue that idea a little bit more later. The importance of allegory, meaning that is a fundamental approach of medieval mystics to everything. We discussed that idea. Now, notice Origen here is a key figure, and he is a conduit of Philo. He was an Alexandrian scholar, eventually moves to Caesarea, but he was a conduit of Philo and Neoplatonism into Christianity. Now, his more influence in the East, but some of his stuff was translated in the West. He also uses the term epioptic, which means beyond or over the eyes, meaning things that are beyond what can be seen. So beyond the visible world is what epioptic means. And then he also raises this idea that the Greeks borrowed from Solomon. Now, notice, that idea comes from Philo, that the Greek philosophy derived from Moses and Solomon, who antedate Plato and all these guys, right? They're earlier than Plato. So the Greeks studied with these guys, and they learned their philosophy from them. And when Plato comes up with Greek philosophy, it's based, at least in part, on biblical ideas. And what this does is legitimize Greek philosophical ideas to be incorporated into Christian, especially Greek mysticism, but also Latin to some extent. Augustine is another Platonizing Christian mystic. And when you look at Augustine's City of God, when he discusses what he calls the Platonists, but by which he means what we would call Neoplatonists, when Augustine discusses those, he says they almost are right on everything. There's only a couple of things they're wrong about. one is the Trinity, and there's something else. I can't remember what the other thing is, but they are right, meaning in reality, Augustine is a Neoplatonic Christian, and from him, Neoplatonic ideas pass into Western Christianity, Western mysticism. And then the third figure is Dionysius, which we'll discuss a little bit later. Okay? Now, we discussed, most of these writings, I think, let me just ask you this, I think these are more intelligible to you than the Jewish stuff. And that's in part because, we have a Christian background, and so we understand, it's just more familiar, those ideas. And in part because they're kind of more straightforward. The Jewish stuff has a lot of just extraneous, unique ideas that are fed into the Jewish mystical traditions. And the Muslims will have that as well to a differing degree. So they're going to be harder to understand than the Western ones. But are you getting this as you read through McGinn's book? Okay. What you need to do is come with some questions too, because I'm assuming you're going to understand this better than you did the Jewish stuff. But bring up a question if there's something you want to discuss more. Notice the discussion of the divine nature as this infinite, boundless thing, and the discussion of mind as the way in which we encounter God is through mind. Now, spirit and mind become synthesized in some of these monastic traditions, but it is something that is purely in the mind or the spirit, not in the body, that you encounter God. And Gregory of Nyssa is kind of anti-anthropomorphic. I mean, he's reached the point where God can't have a body because he's infinite and all that type of stuff. Okay, we've talked about the ascetic practices. Last idea we need to mention is apophatic theology. Now, apophatic means can't describe it, something like that, undescribable. But really what it means is what we call negative theology. That's how that term is translated into English. Negative theology means God is so transcendent and infinite beyond everything that he cannot be described in any positive way. You only describe him as by what he is not. He's not this, he's not, he has no body. Okay, that doesn't tell you what he is, but it tells you what he's not. So you see a lot of negative theology in mysticism. Doesn't mean it's, opposed to theology or bad theology. It means you are using descriptions of what God and mystical experiences are not to narrow the field so people can understand it. But remember, you can only understand this if you experience it. So they'll say, we have to use apophatic language because you've got to experience it. So it's kind of like this, it's not like this, it's not like that, it's not like this. But once you've experienced it, you'll get it. And then you won't need the apophatic theology. Does that make sense to people? So negative here does not mean opposed to it or bad or they hate theology or whatever. It just means they use descriptions of what God is not and what mystical experience is not to try to describe it. Okay, anything else? All right, we will see.